Hi guys, it is a gloomy day here in the end times up here in the former paradise of South Austin, Texas, but we are going to go to the other side of the planet today to warm, sunny Australia, I believe Sydney, Australia, on this Tuesday afternoon, February 13th, 2018, for our latest edition of Voices from the Doomosphere. And I have the major honor of interviewing one of my Humpty Dumpty tribe heroes, Professor Andrew Glikson. If you're not familiar with Andrew Glikson, he is an earth and paleoclimate scientist at the Australian National University, the author of several books, many articles. We're going to be talking particularly about his book about the Plutocene. The full title of his story about the Plutocene, if I can call it up here, is The Plutocene: Blueprints for a Post-Anthropocene Greenhouse Earth. So this promises to be a lively discussion. So, Andrew Glikson, come say hello to the tribe and give us a short introduction.
How are you?
Are you there?
Yes.
Okay. So you just do you want to add anything to that short introduction that I gave about your bio, or should we just dive right in to your views?
Yeah, fair enough. My background is as a geologist and earth scientist, working on the Australian continent. But the climate, the history of the atmosphere, ocean system is very much a part of our science, and that's what we're looking at now. As I was saying, it's very much like or climate scientists have very much a role like a medical doctor in looking at the health of the atmosphere ocean system and the effect on humans and on nature. Think about it as a medical science looking at the exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen through the lungs of humans, the lungs of animals, and the lungs of nature.
So a paleoclimatologist, the way I understand, that obviously is referring that you are looking to past ages, I would assume, to help define our present age and to predict our future ages as history repeats itself. Is that fairly accurate description of a paleoclimatologist?
Well, that's right. We're looking at the history of the climate with implications, with major implications to what is happening at the present time with the effect of humans and carbon emissions on the atmosphere and hydrosphere, the oceans, and on living systems.
Okay, so well, let's diagnose the patient. I guess presently the patient, that would be planet Earth, is in what more and more people are calling I've heard it pronounced Anthropocene and the Anthropocene. I call it the Moranocene is my name for it. What is define how would you define the Anthropocene as it's playing out in 2018 and diagnose the patient in February of 2018?
Yeah, right. Well, again, like patients, if we get 40% more carbon dioxide into our lungs, well, there will be an effect. There's also a small reduction in oxygen. How do I define the Anthropocene? Well, there are more than one definition. The classical one is since the onset of the industrial age, which is about 1750. Another definition is from the mid-20th century, right after World War II, when the release emission of carbon dioxide has increased exponentially. And yet another one is when you're looking at the Neolithic, the start of a large-scale human cultivation of the land, and the release of carbon and methane, and as a result of agriculture. There is one more even, when you're looking at the mastery of fire by prehistoric humans, which then applied it to pretty large-scale burning. That's the one which I'm looking at because of my geological background.
So you say the Anthropocene started with the invention of fire, and it's pretty much all been downhill from there?
Well, there was a long lull since the mastery of fire, which is at least 1 million years ago. There is no evidence of major damage to nature over almost a million years. But from the beginning of the Neolithic, which is approximately 11,000 years ago, there is certainly a lot of evidence for tribal ignition of large forests and prairies in connection with hunting and in connection with land clearing and war.
So certainly for 11,000 years we have become a rising geologic force on the planet, including the atmosphere.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Okay, so where are we? The question I ask, and as I say, you sound like a gentleman, Andrew, unlike some of the people I interview, but let me tone my question down. Here on February 13th of 2018, are we screwed?
I wouldn't like the term screwed. I'd say we are in existential danger.
Well, okay. I guess we could. That sounds like screwed to me, but existential danger. So, what are? I'm sure you are involved. I know you are because some of your commentaries I've read. Talk to us a little bit about the doomsday clock being moved to 2 minutes to midnight. Do you think that's a proper place for it, or are we closer than 11:58 p.m.?
Well, I feel we are very close. See, the climate change, global warming, takes place over some decades, even a century or two. But the nuclear risk, as you know from the daily news, it's here with us. It can happen anytime, even due to accident. When you get such huge batteries of missile ready on both sides, it can even happen inadvertently. And when you look at the history of the last 70 years since World War II, there have been any number of close calls with nuclear weapons. So the systems designed to prevent an accidental war, well, who knows? They are not perfect, and it's enough that a small mishap happens, and there will be the use them or lose them principle. I just had a paper published this morning. I think I might have sent it to you already, which includes a list of the accidents which happened since World War II.
There's probably more on that list we're never going to hear of. In addition to that growing list, where do you think the biggest? I was just predicting myself this morning that we probably are going to see some sort of nuclear weapon detonated somewhere along the India-Pakistan border very soon, and I see a full-scale nuclear war building in the South China Sea. But this is my view. Where do you see the biggest hot spots for something blowing?
Well, there are a number of them. Like you say, South China Sea, India, Pakistan. There is, of course, North and South Korea. There is Ukraine. There is Syria. Particularly in Syria now, you get both U.S. or Western and as well as Soviet, Russian aircraft. It's enough that an aircraft gets downed and you get either a real or a false flag type of accidents, and the rest follows. I don't know that the systems are in place to prevent such a probability.
I see no evidence. The only evidence I see is an increasing probability with at least every time I turn on the news. Do you think we are actually closer to the mushroom cloud here in 2018 than we were in let's say 1958?
Well, that's what the scientists of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists think. Now, this is a very powerful group. The people highly experienced in whether it's nuclear weapons, whether it's climate, whether it's international relations. They have moved the arms of the clock to 2 minutes to midnight. That's the closest it was since 1953. So, yes, this is a reason for real worry. And yet, the world is preoccupied with secondary and tertiary issues rather than with this particular ultimate risk.
Yes, to put it mildly. But you personally are not involved in the de-nuclear movement or anything like that. I mean, professionally, you're more at the climate end of it. I mean, the nuclear issue is more just of a pet concern of yours.
Well, yes, I'm mostly involved with the climate side of things, but I have been in the past a member of groups, like a group called Scientists Against Nuclear Arms, and I'm in close contact with people, Medical Association Against Nuclear War. Ultimately, it's all to do with the conditions of the atmosphere and the ocean and their effect on life. So the two issues are closely related.
Yeah, there are plenty of dots. So let's steer the conversation more to the climate end of it. I would like to say that I've had a chance to read your book on the Plutocene. I'm not just going to sit here. There was an article in Newsweek magazine. I'm glad to see is giving you press, and they titled it "The Plutocene Era. Forget Doomsday. We are about to enter a hellish radioactive age." Was that your title, or did the editors of Newsweek put for the Forget Doomsday?
It's not my title. As you know, normally journals give their own titles to articles. So it's not my title, and it's not a title that I would have given. We already have entered the nuclear age in 1945 with the Los Alamos blast. And I try not to use sensational language. I try to stick to a scientific evidence instead.
Well, tell us about well, just in your own words, let's hear it. Boil down the premise of your book, the Plutocene. What is the Plutocene, and when can we look forward to it being here?
It is here since the first
I see what you're saying. We're in the Plutocene, so we're right now. We're in some sort of the Anthropocene is already behind us.
It's the overlap. There is no sharp boundary. But in geology, we use geological markers. And the geological marker of the Plutocene already is and will continue to be a layer rich in plutonium at the bottom of the seas, because that's where the radioactive elements go. It already has been studied, measured, and if there are people in 1,000 years or more, and if there are any geologists then study the composition of the ocean layers, they will come across this layer, and that's how we define geological ages.
So are you talking about the plutonium in the bottom of the ocean? Are you talking about from anthropogenic radiation mostly between bomb testing and nuclear waste, or are you talking about some natural creation of this being exacerbated by climate change, or is it a little bit of everything?
No, it's not a natural process. All the plutonium and other radioactive elements, they are the results of whether it's nuclear tests or whether it's spilled from industrial nuclear effluent, such as Fukushima. It's not natural, no, and it's not directly related to climate change. These are separate processes, but both of them are critically dangerous.
Yeah, I just watched this documentary last night on the dome. Are you familiar with that thing up in the Marshall Islands? That nuclear waste repository that apparently has been leaking for years up in the Marshall Islands. What is your take on that? What is your take on that thing? I just heard of it for the first time in my life yesterday.
Well, it's in the Marshall Islands where they have tried to secure it, but it always leaks into the ocean. It's coral reefs and pretty porous material around there. It's the same in Tahiti and Mururoa, large lagoons where underground tests and overground marine tests have been taking place. That's leaking too, and so the story goes on.
And as I say, there's probably examples of the dome all over the planet.
Well, from industrial use, from power plants, it's true in Colombia, the Columbia River. It's true in 3 Mile Islands. It's certainly true in Siberia from the nuclear test, the Soviet nuclear test in Novaya Zemlya. It's highly radioactive. Kazakhstan test, highly radioactive. Gobi Desert test by the Chinese. Yes, it's everywhere, but of course in low doses there will be no short-term or immediate effects. But where there are high concentrations, like Chernobyl, well, it's not an area that humans, or especially young people, children, ought to live in. The cumulative radiation is far too high.
So I'm trying to connect the dots. The dots between all of this that you're talking about and climate change they just feed each other. There's like is that what we're talking about here?
It's difficult to see that the nuclear factor and climate change, global warming, feed each other. They are separate processes, but in terms of the consequences and effect on life, especially human life and civilization, they are both of extreme danger. So nuclear radiation, well, it affects the DNA and affects life, causes genetic danger to life forms, whether it's in the long term or sometimes immediately. But global warming is the difference also with the nuclear issue is that a nuclear war is an imminent danger, but has not quite happened yet. Global warming, the train has left the station. We're now looking at extreme rise in the carbon dioxide and therefore in global temperatures, extreme weather events, whether it's fires or hurricanes. In fact, large parts of the world, especially in the islands, in the Caribbean and the Southwest Pacific, are islands and coral islands which are extremely vulnerable to hurricanes, as you very well know, in Texas.
Yes, and I spent a lot of time on St. Croix in the Caribbean, which was pretty much, just obliterated a few months ago in St. Croix. So what is give us your vision of 2050? Where are you on the?
Where am I? Well, I'll probably be 10 feet underground.
Yes, you probably hope so. I mean, where are you on the spectrum of climatologists? You hear so many, people trying to stare into the crystal ball. What is coming back? What is your vision inside the crystal ball for the magic 2050?
Well, the serious scientists, and many of them are in your country, the United States, groups such as James Hansen and his very large group of scientists, many of them paleoclimate scientists, and there is Mann, Robert Mann, and so on, Michael Mann. So actually, United States is a big center for climate science. What do I think 250? You see, the climate does not, global warming does not occur as a regular trend. There are highs and lows. There is an increase in variability. On average, the globe is warming. But as it's warming, you can get transient snaps, like the cold, freezing snaps, which you have in the United States. There could be very large snaps. There is a phenomenon which is called stadials. Stadials are reversals, temperature, climate reversals during the peak of interglacial periods. What happens is the cold water from the melting glaciers, such as from Greenland in particular, but also from Antarctic, they cool the oceans. And for a period of, it can be a few decades or a few centuries, it can be quite long. The last ones lasted 200 years, the one before then lasted more than 1,000 years. These freeze events result from the influx of cold water from the melting glaciers and result in either regional or global reversal of temperatures. So we're not looking here at regular warming, we're looking here at increased variability, and that's very dangerous in its own right.
So what you're saying is it's to try to make an accurate prediction of what this planet's going to look like in 2050, that things can just come in rather suddenly from left field. Is that what I heard you saying?
Exactly right. That's exactly right. See, science tried to model the future, but I cannot see that models can predict accurately specific events and specific magnitude of events. What the models do best is predict trends. So in a way, there have been errors made in the science in that linear trends have been portrayed in what would more likely be extreme variability or variations in the climate, but on the whole, as the level of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere rises, the globe is warming with local reversals or temporary reversals.
I'm sure you've heard the new report about, I guess the latest is that sea level rise now they are saying is happening a lot quicker than previously thought. It's like every Wednesday I do my climate change roundup stories where I go through all the new stories, and what I've been noticing, and I just want to see if you've been noticing the same thing that I have, is that more and more what I'm hearing is this term worse than we previously thought. That over and over again the new research is coming out where the newest evidence is that it's worse than we thought, and that the worst case scenarios might be a long way from the worst case scenarios. Are you noticing that?
Yeah, certainly. I'm afraid you're right. That's been forecasted by James Hansen and his group first, even in the 1980s. They did not see that Greenland, which is really an island, could last for as long as the IPCC, that's the International Panel for Climate Change. They could not see that Greenland can last as long. Same with West Antarctic. So they predicted very high levels of sea level rise through the century, this century. They were talking about several meters, maybe 5. But the IPCC and other groups of scientists said, no, it's not going to be more than 1 meter. Well, looking at Greenland and the rate at which the glacial sheet melts and West Antarctic, I'm afraid always thought that James Hansen was right. So meter scale sea level rise, similar to what was the case in the last interglacial, is now very likely.
1 meter. And do you think it could go quite a bit higher than that? Is 1 meter still on the conservative end?
No, what I was saying is meters, several meters.
Oh, 7 meters, several? Several meters.
Through the century.
Yeah, and yeah. Where do you see this? One topic that's discussed a lot in this circle is when we're going to see the first blue ocean event in the Arctic Ocean, and when are we going to see that? And what is going to be the effect of that? What is your spin on the blue ocean event up there?
Well, the Arctic sea ice is already melted to a large extent. It's now quite a few tenths of percent lower during the summer. And talking about ocean sea routes or ship routes going through, and talking about drilling in the Arctic sea ice has been melting for a long time now. There are accurate data to show that. What do I think about it? But the other thing is the Arctic Ocean and the large glaciers, they reflect infrared, they reflect radiation, solar radiation back to the atmosphere. But as they melt, the water, the opening blue water, absorb radiation, which means this is a huge factor for further warming of the Earth. In fact, it's as big, it's a feedback mechanism for global warming, but its effect is just as large as that of all the carbon dioxide emitted combined.
When do you have any prediction on when we're going to see? Is that going to happen as early as this year, or are we still 5, 10 years? What's your reading of the tea leaves on the blue ocean event?
Well, like I said, climate science doesn't give year-by-year predictions. They can to some extent, but we can't give magnitude of events or numbers. We're talking about trends. What do I say? Well, some years it's decreases, the ice decreases fast. Some years it becomes more stable. The variability increases. It increases as the oceans around the ice sheets melt. It increases as the stratospheric circulation, the jet stream change, like the boundary between the polar atmosphere and between the intermediate or the medium latitude atmosphere. The boundary becomes irregular, and you get cold storms, snow storms, intruding, projecting from the north to the south. So I can't give any accurate predictions now. I don't think any climate scientist would be able to do that.
So you say you're not on board with it happening in the next 2 or 3. Do you eliminate the chance of it happening in the next 2 or 3 years, or do you think that's pretty unlikely?
It's happening now, on and off. If you look at the record of the last 20, 30 years, you get both heat waves and you get snowstorms. And of course, the United States, as you know, is suffering from extreme weather events to a greater extent than some other parts of the world, because you get on the south, you get the Gulf of Mexico, which is a warm, cold one, very hot ocean and air, with hurricanes and so on, which you've just experienced. And in the north, you get Labrador and Greenland, and you get cold air protruding south. So particularly the eastern part of the United States is an open ground for movement of air masses of extremely either high or low temperature.
We're certainly getting evidence of that. But before I obviously want to get into what we're going to do about this. But one more question about the state of the planet now is the whole notion of what some people refer to as the methane. I guess down in Australia you say methane. The methane bomb. Where do you see methane playing into the mix over the next few decades as the permafrost and all that begins to thaw?
Yes, that's a critical factor which you just touched on. We didn't talk about it before, but as the permafrost starts to be affected by warming in Siberia and in North Canada and so on, the organic matter which has been buried in the permafrost over tens of thousands and more square kilometers, but also in sediments in the Arctic Ocean, starts to bubble out, and very high levels have been measured. The previous level was, I think, about 1,600 parts per billion. Now in some areas it's more than 2,000. And methane, as you know, oxidizes to carbon dioxide. It has very high greenhouse effect. And this is an increasingly important factor in global warming.
So do you... I've heard some people, which might be called on the alarmist end of it, talking about a sudden, like 50 gigaton, what they're calling a burp of methane. Is something like that really likely to happen? Where I just mean a huge, like in a space of a few weeks, just a massive amount of methane being erupting into the atmosphere. Do you have any bad dreams about something like that?
It's been observed locally in the permafrost in Siberia. There are craters which have actually blown out by concentrations of methane. And there are many leaks. Like you must have seen the videos.
Oh yeah, the Pongos.
Well, they dig a small hole in the permafrost, put a match to it, and there is a flame.
There you go.
So methane is bubbling out at the bottom of the sea, is bubbling out through the permafrost, and it's building up. It's all a part of the underlying factor for the rise in carbon dioxide, which is now between 2 and 3 parts per million per year. Now, this rate has not been seen on Earth in the past after 55 million years ago. 55 million years ago, there was a large eruption of methane, which has resulted in a rise of temperature of 4, 5, or 6 degrees. It's called the PETM, the Paleocene-Eocene thermal events.
How many years did that span? Are we talking 5 years or 5,000 years, that event, for that much methane to be released?
Yeah, it was released over a period of several thousand years.
Okay.
So in fact, the rate of release, and there's excellent papers about it. There's an article in Scientific American. I can send you the reference. It was a huge event, but even the rate of release of methane and carbon dioxide at that time was not as high as it is now.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I will send you the paper.
Yeah, I would like to add. Yeah, I would like to add that to my roundup tomorrow. But anyway, we need to move along to the next major section of this conversation, which I always, I guess in many ways the more important part of the conversation is what is your opinion on our, just as a species, as a global community being confronted by this existential danger staring us in the face? Is our reaction to it, how would you define our level of reaction on a global scale to the problem confronting us?
Very weak indeed. In fact, emissions of carbon are only rising in many parts of the world. People many people are aware of it, of course, but people still want to live from day to day and put food on the table, and corporations want to increase their profits, and politicians want to remain in office. The business as usual syndrome, which amounts to a denial syndrome, is still paramount. And yes, I wish I was more hopeful than I am.
So, I mean, it seems to me that the biggest, the main way that we have decided we're going to attack this problem is with the Paris Climate Agreement. Give me your opinion of, is the Paris Climate Accord going to save the planet from the existential despair facing us?
It's an expression of goodwill on the part of most nations, but there's no commitment. And the atmosphere doesn't take account of our good intentions. Either they lower the emission level or cut it down abruptly, or they don't. The only other way would be to draw down, sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. That's a huge enterprise, and the cost would be for effective sequestration and burial of the carbon would be expenditure on the scale which currently go into the military and into war. I wish I could see signs of humanity following this route, but as you know, the danger of war is only growing. Military expenses are only growing, and very, very little is done about trying to draw down carbon dioxide. In fact, almost nothing. Yes, I'm afraid I wish I could express good news or better news than this.
So you don't see any savior on the horizon. Is there any evidence that this planet, either, even if we have the technical ability, which I'm not at all sure we do to do anything about it, it's the political will. I just don't. I mean, I don't see it, and particularly with our new president, it's just been thrown out the window. The whole conversation.
Yes, there were some very good people there. Excellent people in the United States. I'm thinking about Al Gore, of course. Obama understood the problem, and I think he intended to do something serious about it. But the conservative forces and the promoters of fossil fuels, they seem to have the upper hand now. And I think it's only when people will realize the consequences. You see, these disasters, like I'm thinking particularly about the hurricanes in the Caribbean and the southeast United States, but also the huge fires such as in California and in Europe. If people realize that these are expressions of global warming, they might start to do something about it. But the press, the media, is it's complicit in the event, in that while they describe these extreme weather events, they don't always connect it with as expressions of climate change.
You mean the big mainstream media, certainly.
Yeah.
So I don't hear you hopping on any sort of. Are you a promoter of any of the geoengineering solutions being put forward as a way to battle this?
Well, yes, carbon dioxide drawdown or sequestration is a geoengineering measure, and there are a number of techniques which includes seaweed growth on large scale. This absorbs carbon dioxide from the oceans. Seaweed farming, it's actually being done in some parts of the world, such as South Korea, for example. Then there are other methods like biochar, which means burial of carbon in the soil, which once again will fertilize and absorb carbon dioxide. There are other methods industrial methods like sodium hydroxide and sequestration through the exposure of serpentine and basalt. Some is being done in Iceland. So certainly, yeah, this is, in fact, I cannot see another way. Limiting carbon emission is essential, but carbon is accumulative, which means already what there is in the atmosphere, which is 407 parts per million CO2, but also a very large amount of methane. That's already far, far too high. And that's already triggering melting of the large ice sheets. So, yes, geoengineering, I'd say a combination of abrupt reduction in carbon emission and geoengineering is what's needed.
But the reality of either one of those happening at any sort of the scale we're talking about at this level of our heading over the cliff, I don't see it. I don't see it happening, and I don't hear you exactly sounding like you do either. Is that safe to say?
We're talking here about human nature. If our representative, democratic representative, supposed to be, would have made a major decision to convince or instruct industry and the military to channel their resources, and there are, of course, we're talking about trillions of dollars, from warlike and other industrial purposes, channel it into carbon sequestration. Like, for example, England did at the outset of World War II, where Churchill, his government instructed industry to move from peaceful to military systems, and within a very short time. If that's what was done, if the danger to the planet was realized and acted upon by political leaders, instructing industry and the military to put the resources into mitigation and other measures and adaptation, then perhaps something could have been done, but it's getting late.
Yeah, I see you did not phrase that could be done. It could have been done. Maybe if we had been doing this in the 1970s, maybe. But, you know, at what point is the window going to be shut? And
yeah, they have to do everything which can be done now. But the longer they delayed it, the more difficult it becomes. Like you say, if they did it in the 1970s, 1980s, on a large scale, on the required scale, maybe something could have been done. It's very hard to predict because these are self-amplifying feedback-based mechanisms. The more carbon dioxide you have in the atmosphere, the higher the temperature, the more carbon dioxide is emitted from the oceans and from drying vegetation. So it's a self-amplifying, it's a feedback mechanism. But if they caught it at an early stage and done something meaningful about it, well, yes, indeed. Now it's late in the day, but still, if they decided to do something about it, then we would have had a chance.
Okay, well, finally, I see it. Well, good Lord, we're already at close to 45 minutes. So what I always like to finish these conversations on is, particularly with my listeners, we talk a lot about getting depressed here and with all of this bad news. And so I always like to bring it back to the individual. What can anyone listening to this interview right now, what in their lives can they do just to make any difference on any single level, and just as importantly, what can they do just to keep from being just completely overwhelmed with defeat? Do you have any advice?
That's right, indeed. Indeed, well, people need to understand and when they understand the consequences, particularly for future generations, what they can do on a small scale, grow vegetables in the back of their yards, perhaps ride bicycles as much as they can, or electric vehicles. There are quite a number of measures to reduce the effect on the environment, but on a larger scale, it is to promote the election of representatives who understand the issue and are prepared to act on it. And there are such people. Once again, I'm thinking about Al Gore, his extraordinary efforts over more than 30 years now, because he fully understands the issue. He acts on the basis of the science. If there were more people like him, groups of people, parties, movements, well, yes, indeed. You see, denial seems to occur in some of the Anglo-Saxon countries. In Europe, there is a greater appreciation of the problem, but the problem is a global problem. Emissions now are most serious coming from China, from the US. It is a global problem, and that's where the Paris Accord came in, because nations understood that it is of global dimensions, but they did not have either the power or the courage to make this limitation compulsory. These limitations in emission and also drawdown effect must be written into law, because it's a question of survival. It's a question of survival, and once people and nations fully appreciate it, perhaps they can do something about it.
Okay, well, getting back to you personally, how many years have you been doing this, and do you personally ever get overwhelmed and depressed by your chosen life's work? Does it ever just get you down?
Well, in the 1980s and so on, I was active with a group called Scientists Against Nuclear Arms. We were, and we are now, extremely worried about the nuclear prospect of nuclear war. Once it became clear that apart from the nuclear issue, climate, global warming are progressing, then about, what is it now, I think more than 15 years ago, I became active with the climate issue. But personally, when you're exposed to issue of this magnitude for a long time, as I have, in a way, when you are in the water, you don't feel wet any longer, do you? So in a way, you become conditioned to it, and you develop some defense mechanisms. Well, my defense mechanisms is, I look at it as, I compare it with the great mass extinctions of geological times. I fear there is one going on now. And because I am, in my background, a geologist, I, in a way, look at it in long-time terms. But when I think about young children, about us, about future generations, about beautiful nature, there is a despair, but in a way, emotionally, it's now just became, like the atmosphere we breathe. It became such a part of reality to me that I can look at it in perspective.
I'm just curious, do you have children and grandchildren yourself?
Yeah, they have grown up and are now leading their own life. Yes, I have grandchildren. Yes, indeed.
How do you just feel as a grandparent with I assume young grandchildren inheriting this earth? Is there? I don't have any kids, so I don't know what I don't know what it must feel like to have children and grandchildren right now.
I feel sad about it. I feel very sad. It does help when you're active. They used to say during the Cold War, which actually is now, they say, be active or radioactive. Well, by trying to do something, the tiny little which I try to do in terms of, well, books, papers, interviews, lectures, it somehow at least gives me a sense that that's all I can do. I really don't know what else I could do. So by doing the tiny little which I do, I think it feels right.
Well, we certainly appreciate your output, that you are keeping up the good fight, and that's all we can do. So anyway, in closing, so I always just like to close, and if you weren't talking to me, but you actually had a 60-second soundbite on NBC News here in the United States. You had 60 seconds to give your message to the planet here in February of 2018. What would that soundbite sound like?
Well, I would say to people, especially young people, let's say, take care. I'd say something huge is now developing in the world, which is a major threat, an existential threat to your future. So try and understand it and take care and try and do what's possible to try and mitigate it or adapt to it or prevent it.
There you go, and that's the best we can do. Okay, well, Andrew Glikson, well, stick around for just a minute after we sign off, but I just do want to say we really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule. Good Lord. I can only imagine what you face every day, brother. But we do appreciate it, just so you know that there are a lot of us out here who appreciate those of you who are keeping up the good fight. And with that, thank you once again.
Yes, thank you very much for the interview. I really appreciate your efforts, and I wish you all the very best.
All right, so I'm going to say, well, as they stick around for just a minute, but I am going to say, anyway, guys, that was Andrew Glikson, and we do appreciate his input, and we will be back next week. I'm not sure who we'll have on next week, but someone, I assure you. Hang in there, guys. Bye.